we will sure. All right, so you should all see the PowerPoint now. Let me see if I can move this a little bit so that I can see the clock. Okay. So tonight we're going to take a look at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Joshua and Judges are timeline books, and Ruth is really fits in during the time of Judges, so this makes a nice little group here. So we'll start by looking at Joshua. Again, this is a timeline book. The title of the book is Joshua, who was Moses' lieutenant and became Moses' successor. Now, Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, which, as you might recall from Genesis, the tribe of Joseph got split into two, right? He got split into Manasseh, into Ephraim, and that was based on Joseph's two sons. So Joseph wound up getting really more inheritance than the rest of the people because, again, he was Jacob's favorite. He is the main character of the book. Obviously, the book is named after him. He's the main character. Joshua also shares a name with the Messiah, right? Because Joshua, or Yeshua in Hebrew, which means the Lord saves. Whenever you get that E sound, that's Elohim. So that's the Lord. Yesh means save. So, it's the Lord saves. Jesus would be the Greek form of Yeshua, right? In Hebrew, it's Yeshua. In Greek, it was Jesus, and then we just transliterate it into English. So the main concept, again, going back to that first night, the main concept was conquest. And that's the conquest of the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham back in the day. So the Lord saves, right? Joshua saves from slavery, and he provides a new home. And it fulfills part of the Abrahamic covenant, like I just said. In Genesis 12:1, first part of the verse says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Again, he was down in the area of about Babylon. He goes up and around to not go through the Arabian desert, and he comes back down and he sojourns in the land that God promises him, the land of Canaan. Now, some important dates. Well, last week we established that the date of the Exodus was 1445 BC. And again, all these dates are BC. Now, the conquest, so 40 years after the Exodus, the conquest starts in about 1405, and it takes about 5 years. Now, some commentaries, some books will put it at about 7 years, but 5 to 7 years is the conquest, and that's the focus of this book, is getting into the promised land, conquering it, and then dividing it up. And we'll see that when we look at the outline. And so the events that are covered really from about 1406, just prior to going into the promised land, to about 1390. And in 1390, the book is penned. There's a lot of firsthand accounts in there. Presumably from Joshua. So now the Jewish tradition says that Joshua wrote it. One of the hints to the authorship being Joshua, in Joshua 24:26, it says, "And Joshua wrote these words in the book of law of God." So again, this kind of points to the fact that Joshua wrote it. And I don't think there's anything else I want to say there. So the key chapter, again, going back to that first night when we were talking about the timeline books and what the key chapter was chapter 6, which is the Battle of Jericho. Jericho was the stronghold of the land of Canaan. It was the most fortified city. They went in, the Israelites went in after crossing the Jordan. The first city they took on was Jericho. Some of the key people in the book is Joshua, obviously. Now, Joshua was about 55 years old at the Exodus, which then makes him 95 years old at the conquest. So he's starting to age But again, because of lifespans, he's still really in good shape, right? Again, they wandered in the desert for 40 years, but God took care of them. They didn't, their feet didn't swell, their clothes didn't run out, all that. He dies at 110, and that's recorded in chapter 24, 29. So again, much like when we saw with Deuteronomy, which talks about Moses' death and Moses being the author of Deuteronomy, someone else probably wrote the last chapter or the last, verse, last couple verses of Joshua there. Another key person in there is Caleb. Now, Caleb was he was one of the spies who went in to the Promised Land back when they first exodus from Egypt. And Caleb and Joshua were the only two that said, hey, we can take it right now. Let's go in. And the other 10 spies said no. So, again, crisis of faith. God said, fine, you'll wander in the desert for 40 years, and all you people will die out, all you people over 20, except for Caleb and Joshua. Now, Caleb was about 40 years old at the Exodus, and he gives a really great speech in Joshua 14, verse 10, or starting in 14:10. And, he talks about being 85 years old. So it's just as they finished conquering the land. The outline of Joshua is invading the land, chapters 1 through 5, conquering the land, 6 through 12. Now, in this conquering, you have the central campaign in 6 and 8. Now, the central campaign mostly is going up after Jericho, then Ai. Of course, at Ai, they fail at first because someone from the camp has taken some loot that God told them not to. And, Joshua's laying prone on the ground, crying, whining and saying, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And God tells them to get up and find out who committed the sin inside the nation. And so they find that out, and then they finally go conquer Ai. After that, they kind of split into a southern campaign in chapters 9 and 10, the northern campaign in chapters 11 and 12. And then the settlement of the land is essentially the rest of the book, chapters 13 through 24. So this is a map of what happened or where they came in. So again, they came in from the east. They crossed the Jordan River, and they went in and they crossed the Jordan River. They went in and they took the central area there where they took Jericho right here, and then Ai. Then they had a southern swing and a northern swing at the same time. And so as they came in here, remember when they came across the Jordan, God does a small little miracle there where he, kind of like Joshua's Red Sea moment, where he stops the water from flowing. The people from Israel go ahead and cross on dry land, much the way they did through the Red Sea. This was, again, partly God putting his stamp on Joshua, saying, this is whom I've chosen to lead the conquest of the nation. And so you can see where they came in and went around, and you see this in the first couple of chapters there. Okay. One of the excuse me. One of the problems that people really have with Joshua is really, why is all the killing? Because again, in chapter after chapter during the conquest, you'll see where God tells them to devote everything to destruction, right? Just kill everything. So a lot of people want to point to that and say, well, why does God have to do that? Well, one of the things we need to understand is that this is really nothing new, right? We saw in Genesis 6 during the flood that the people were so evil that God just wipes out every breathing thing except for Noah and 2 animals of, every kind. And because, he's a holy God, and he finds the sin abhorrent. And so he wants to start all over again. And he starts with Noah and his family. So he wipes out all of humanity. Not only that, but he destroys, all the animals. The whole environment changes. And as we talked about then, that after Genesis, we start seeing people's ages starting to decrease. So, the whole ecosystem was changed by that. We don't even get out of Genesis before we have other destructions, right? The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah completely destroyed because of the sin in those cities. And there's a lot of people I want to say, well, that's the Old Testament God. He's really angry and cranky. In between the testaments, he took a nap, he woke up, he's a loving God now. Well, in 2 Peter 3, he tells us he's going to destroy the world once again, but it's going to be by fire. And then when you read Revelations, there's all kinds of death and destruction in Revelation. So this is something that's consistent throughout the Bible. It's nothing new. God finds the sin to be abhorrent, and so he takes action for that. It's also part of the promise. Now, the promise in Genesis 3 is that we're all going to die. That once sin entered the world, right, we were all going to die. First, it was a relational death between Adam and Eve and God. That relational death happened, and then there was also a curse on the land, on the entire earth. And even in Romans, it says that, the earth has been groaning as in childbirth, and it wasn't the creation that wanted it. It was the Creator who deemed that. Again, because of sin, God said that all that was going to happen. And we're part of the earth. And so that's why we decay. That's why as we get older, our body starts falling apart. It's just harder to get out of bed in the morning. And that just happens. It's all because the promise is there. Okay. So what's with all the killing? What's the principle? Well, in Romans 6:23, God tells us through the pen of the Apostle Paul that the wages of sin is death. And that's all there is to it. We're all steeped in sin. The pattern is, in Jeremiah 11:17 tells us that there was always persistent warnings. Even in the time of Noah, when we talked about Genesis, we talked about the flood, we said it took about 100 years for Noah and his people to build that ark. Well, all that time, Noah was telling the people, but they just wanted to ignore him and all that. There's always persistent warnings. And again, in Jeremiah 11, it says, the Lord of hosts who planted you has decreed disaster against you because of the evil. That's what he's telling the people. And he's consistently, throughout the entire Bible, persistently warning us that if we don't trust in him, if we don't follow him, if we don't follow his plan, that we will die. If we do trust him, we follow his plan, then we will be saved. So now the situation in Canaan, it was horrible. The people were terrible, a lot of sin, and it had reached extreme levels. When you read Leviticus 18, the first couple of verses says to the Israelites, don't be like the people in Egypt where you're coming from, and don't be like the people in Canaan where you're going. And then he lists all these sins, all these moral sins, and that's where you get like all the laws, all those sexual immorality sins that are in there. But it all starts with, don't be like the people you're going in to see. Merle Unger, who passed away many years ago, he was professor of archaeology and of the Old Testament. He's written several books. He said the brutality, lust, and abandon of Canaanite mythology is far worse than elsewhere in the Near East at the time. And the astounding characteristic of the Canaanite deities, that they would have no moral character whatever, must have brought out the worst traits in their devotees, entail many of the most moralizing practices at the time, such as sacred prostitution, child sacrifice, and snake worship. Moloch was one of the major gods of Canaan, and they would sacrifice babies to the god Moloch. They would have temple prostitution. That's which we saw. Really, you see that all the way up even into Greco-Roman times, where you would see that happening. So, again, the people of Canaan, very evil people, and God had warned them. And he commanded in Deuteronomy 20:16 to have complete destruction. And if you read Deuteronomy 20:16, it says, everything that breathes shall die. Again, when we get to Joshua 2, in chapters 10, or Joshua 2, verses 10 and 11, they're talking with Rahab, and Rahab knows, they've all known, right? They've seen this great multitude of people, the Israelites, come up. They've defeated kings along the way, and they know that God is with them, and they know that they've been given a chance. And what Rahab says is, essentially, you took the heart right out of us because we know that you were coming. So not only that, but once they get there, there's plenty of time to repent or to leave. You can either repent or you can get out. Joshua even gives them the chance for them just to leave the area. But the only person that repents and is saved is Rahab. We get to chapter 6, Rahab is saved because she trusted, right? So Rahab and her family, only ones in all of Jericho to be saved because they repented. And so again, people who want to say, and we'll talk about this really even when we get to Ruth a little bit, how in the Old Testament God is so heterocentric, right, to Israel, and doesn't really care about anybody else and all that. Well, here, we have this Canaanite woman, Rahab, who trusts in the Lord, is saved, and she winds up becoming, and she's in the lineage, winds up being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So again, nationality, being of Abraham, although means quite a bit, it doesn't mean everything. What really means everything is trusting in God. You repent, you get saved. All right, the land allotment, which again takes up really almost half the book. Just point out a couple things on here. I'm pretty sure in the handout I put this map in there of where all the different tribes went. Now, a couple things to kind of point out is here you have the Dead Sea, and then you got the Jordan River going up to the Sea of Galilee, and then, it runs up into here too. And that kind of splits the east, or, the Transjordan area here, right? You got the east of the Jordan, you got the west of the Jordan. Now, the area west of the Jordan is the area that God had promised to Abraham. Down here you have Judah, which again, a major tribe, right? Why is Judah? We hear a lot about Judah all through the Old Testament, really in the New Testament. Why? Because that's the tribe essentially that Jesus comes from. That's the tribe that David came from. So you have that tribe. And what's to point out here is that Simeon winds up actually being surrounded by Judah. And so it's kind of in there, surrounded by all that. You have Kadesh is down here. That's Kadesh Barnea. That's the southern end of Israel, southern end of the Judah territory there. That's where the Israelites had originally come to, and they said, we can't do it. We can't take the land. And so God sends them back out into the wilderness. When they come back up, they come through this way. When we get up here, I want to point out that Manasseh and Ephraim, right, they're the sons of Joseph. And Manasseh is a split tribe. And you see on the east side of the Jordan, you have Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, because they asked for land allotment over there. Joshua didn't really want to give it to them. But, God says, they can have it, but they all had to go in and fight to take the land with their brothers, right? So they had to go in. If you count up all these tribes, you'll see that there's 12 tribes. But Manasseh and Ephraim both come from Joseph. You also notice that the Levites didn't get a land inheritance. Their inheritance was God. And so they actually got cities in each of the towns. And of course, they would come once Jerusalem is established, which won't be for really a long time after this. But they would come and they would serve in the at the temple. The other thing I'd point out is Dan. Dan started off down here next to Philistia. Well, we know about Philistia. That's where the Philistines are from. And so they were always fighting, and Dan was not necessarily one of the stronger tribes. And they eventually kind of migrated up in here, up into where you see the city of Dan. But up here at the top, that's where Caesarea Philippi was up in here. That's where Jesus took his disciples. That's where Peter declared that he was the Son of God. But there's a lot of pagan worship up in there. So, again, pretty bad area. The only other thing I would point out is that when the kingdom split, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to 1st and 2nd Kings, when the kingdom split, you had the northern 10 tribes went to the north, and then the southern tribes, really, which was Judah and Simeon, and really kind of Benjamin too, went to the south. So that was kind of the split there. And again, all that gets talked about in excruciating detail. All chosen by lot too. Okay, Judges. Judges is another timeline book. It comes right after Joshua in the Bible. Judges, the Hebrew word for that is Shaphat. And it means one who governs or leads, but not a king. So there was 14 judges. 12 of them are discussed in the book of Judges. But they weren't kings, right? They couldn't impose taxes. In reality, they couldn't draft people into the army. They were just people who kind of governed, and they were raised up for normally a specific reason, and we'll talk all about that here as we go through here. And they were an agent of God's deliverance as being the leader, as being chosen by God. Because what was happening is that the Israelites would fall into sin, they would be oppressed, God would send a deliverer. Again, we'll talk more about that. Again, temporary leadership in crisis. And so again, think of the judges as being deliverers, and that might even really be a better name for the book, is the deliverers. The time frame for this is about 1390, or the death of Joshua, which again is referenced in the first chapter, first verse of Judges. And the first failure is in the 2nd chapter. And what I always find ironic, I guess, is that at the very end of Joshua makes that great speech, and he said, and then he finishes up with, "As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. You need to choose what you want." And I'll say, we're going to serve the Lord. We're going to serve the Lord, which, lasted for really 2 chapters, about 15 or 20 years. The whole cycle of Judges, 12 judges in this book, and it lasts about 332 years. And that's a pretty good number based on knowing, like, when Saul becomes king, or really like when Samuel's born and then Saul becomes king, and then all that. And so 1100 BC, somewhere around there, is the birth of Samuel, who is kind of like the last judge. We'll talk more about Samuel next week when we talk about 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1043, Saul becomes king, which is in 1 Samuel 8, and obviously we'll talk about that a lot more. The author of Judges, it's not stated. Now, the tradition is that Samuel wrote it. I don't see any reason why not to go with that tradition. The main concept, again, as we go back to that first week when we were talking about the timeline books, the main concept was failure, and they did it a lot. And they had the failure to destroy the Canaanites, which leads to a lot of problems. They had spiritual failure, which also leads to problems, and it leads to this cycle. In Judges 2, 1 through 4, it says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you to the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. This is what is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And again, I think that Joshua was a great hero of the Old Testament. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact he was lined up right next to Moses, we would probably have a much higher thought of Joshua. But the one place he really failed is he never completely wiped out all the Canaanites, and some of them were left behind. And just as this passage said, they became a thorn in the side of Israel really forever, because again, they continually strayed from God, strayed from his word, strayed from his commandments. And because of the Canaanites, they were enticed by their gods and all that. So again, pretty good commentary on what was going on. Later on in the chapter, starting verse 11, he said, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. So again, that's, the gods, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. And so Baal was kind of the male god of fertility. Ashtoreth was the female god of fertility, not only just for human fertility, but also for all the crops and all that. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them. They were in terrible distress. And this is a cycle that gets repeated several times. In fact, we see here a little bit on the chart that they would be obedient for a while, then they would they would stray away, right? They'd have apostasy, right? Where they would fall away from God. They wouldn't follow his commandments. They would be oppressed. Then they would call out to God. A judge was given, right? When God said, okay, you've suffered enough, a judge was given. They were delivered. And then they had a time period of obedience. And again, they would fall away. And this whole cycle of sin went on for 12 times, as we see through this book. So we had 12 judges in this time frame. So I'm going to try to quickly go through each of the judges. I know, like when you read through Judges, you get all these names, and it just makes your head explode. But what we see here is the judge, who the oppressor was, what chapter did it happen in, and then the years of oppression with resulting peace afterwards. This chart is also in the handout, so you don't have to necessarily write all this stuff down. So it's all there for you to see. And maybe the next time, you read through the book of Judges, you can kind of pull that chart out, and you can see who the judges are, and maybe it'll help make a little more sense. So the first one that we see is Othniel, and the oppressor was the Armenians. Now, the Armenians were from the Mesopotamian area, so they're up from the north there. It happened in chapter 3. They were oppressed for 8 years, and then they had peace afterwards for about 40 years. Of course, then they fell away. They needed another one, so EU came in. The Moabites had come in there, and they oppressed them for about 18 years, but then they had about 80 years of peace. And this happens again in chapter 3 as well. Okay, Shamar is then raised up also towards the end of chapter 3. The Philistines had come in and started oppressing them. The years of oppression and the resulting years of peace is not really given in the book there. So those are the first 3 there in chapter 3. And then we get the story of Deborah and Barak in chapters 4 and 5. Deborah is actually called the prophetess of God, and Barak, because they needed a male leader, I guess. The oppressor were the Canaanites. chapters 4 and 5 for that. So they had 20 years of oppression. They had 20 years of peace. And again, a lot of times we remember Deborah because she was the only female judge. And, because again, she has this great song there in chapter 5. The next one was Gideon, maybe the most famous of the judges. I guess probably depending on what Sunday school you went to, either Gideon or Samson, who we'll talk about later. And you got the Midianites. And again, this is chapters 6, 7, and 8. And, this is, again, the really good story of Gideon right now. I'm too weak. I can't possibly do it. And, then God shows him that he can, and he does the whole thing with the fleece, where he lays the fleece down and only the fleece is wet and everything around it is dry. And then the next day, everything else is wet and then the fleece is dry. And so then he raises up an army, and God says, well, it's way too big. And so he takes them down to the river and says, those who cup the water, you get rid of, but those who lap it like a dog. And you got to remember that dogs during this time were considered, it wasn't like the pets we have today. Dogs were considered really low life animals. And so he whittles it down so the people understand that the victory comes from God and not from Gideon or not from man, but it comes from God. So again, 7 years of oppression by the Midianites and then 40 years of peace afterwards. Now Tola comes in chapter 10. We're not really sure who the oppressor was. And we don't know how many years they were being oppressed, but it was about 23 years of peace afterwards. Then Jar comes in. Now, I think what happens, and if you add up all these years, it just doesn't add up. It just doesn't make physical sense. And so I think what happened was you had a lot of like regional type judges. So like like maybe a tribe or 2 or 3 were being oppressed, and so a judge was raised up to get a particular area. I think Jar was another one of those. Was part of because you got these 3 here in chapter 10 where we don't necessarily have a lot of information about them, but again, they're in there. So you got Jar. We don't know who the oppressor was. We don't know how many years was being oppressed, and 22 years of peace. Then you have Jephthah and the Ammonites, and were the oppressors, 10 years, or chapter 10, 18 years of oppression, but only 6 years of peace. Now, Jephthah, we remember him because he winds up, pledging his daughter to be sacrificed. And he makes this really stupid vow to God that if he gives him victory, when he returns home, the first thing he sees out the door, he'll sacrifice. Turns out to be his daughter. That is not something that God would have wanted. There's no way that he would want human sacrifice. If you read the rest of the Bible, that just wouldn't happen. This kind of falls in the category of sometimes, be careful what you ask for because you might get it. And it's a terrible blot really on this history in Judges. And Judges was a very, very bleak time in Israel's history. I mean, they started off and it just kept cycling down and down and just got worse and worse. Another judge that was raised up was Ibzan. Again, we don't know who the oppressor was. This was in chapter 12. Again, we don't know how many years of peace, but there was only, or years of oppression, but there was only 7 years of peace. And Elon, and then Abdon. And again, all these 3, I think, were all contemporaries of each other. And they, because again, we don't necessarily have a lot of information about it, just that they were raised up and they brought victory to Israel for a certain amount of time. And you can see that these times are getting smaller, pretty much smaller and smaller, at least a little bit of time. And then the last judge in Judges was Samson. And again, Samson, pretty famous guy. The oppressors were the Philistines, and this goes from chapter 13 to 16. Years of oppression was 40 years, but they only wound up getting 20 years of peace out of it. So Samson, again, we know the story. he's not necessarily very godly. He doesn't follow the rules, right? He's not, and he can't tell the truth. He doesn't know what's going on. He's chasing after women all the time. So it's really, really a sad story, and it really kind of caps off all of Judges, because all of Judges is a really sad story. It's just spiraling down, and you have all this suppression going on, and then you have essentially revival just to have it fail again. And so they just keep spinning more and more out of control. If we look at the divine commentary on Judges, Psalm 106 is really talks about the period of the Judges, and it gives God's take on what happened. And so this is kind of a lengthy commentary here, but I think it's important. So starting in verse 34, it says, "They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mixed with the nations and learned to do as they did." Right? And that's not what God wanted. He wanted them to be holy, to be set apart, not to be mixing with the other nations. He wanted them to be the example for all the world to see. They served their idols, which became a snare to them, just like he said it would happen back in Judges, or in the chapter 2. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus they became unclean by their acts and played the whore in their deeds. So again, God pretty upset with Israel during the time of Judges. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people. They abhorred his heritage. He gave them into the hand of the nations, that those who hated them ruled over them. Their enemies oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection under their power. Many times he delivered them, but they were rebellious in their purpose, and he brought them low through their iniquity. So again, 12 times he delivered them, but they were still rebellious, right? They didn't learn their lessons. Verse 44, "Nevertheless, he looked upon their distress when he had heard their cry. For their sake he remembered his covenant. He relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. He caused them to be pitied by all those who held them captive." So again, even though they kept rebelling against him, he never washed his hands of them. He never said, "That's it, I'm done with you." He always remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and said, "Okay, I love you. You are my people. I will rescue you." And again, they would turn back to him for a small amount of time. And really, is there anything different than what we see right now? I mean, we're seeing rebellion all the time. We're seeing idols take the place all the time of God. Not that we're down worshiping idols, but let's face it, we all have idols. We all have things that we kind of put our priority on higher than what we should. Another divine commentary is both in Judges 17:6 and Judges 21:25. And I would be kind of remiss if I didn't bring this out to the point. But it said, "In those days, there was no king in Israel." Well, there was. It was a theocracy. God was their king. But there was no king. There was no head of state, so to speak. So everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And we see this both in 17:6 and in 21:25. And so again, that is just something that we see several times in Judges. Right? There was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it was really evil in the sight of the Lord. So they just weren't paying attention. They weren't following the rules. Okay. That gets us through Judges. And again, very, very bleak time in Israel's history. Obviously, there was good times in there, but for the most part, really bad. So then that brings us to the book of Ruth. Now, the title of the book is Ruth. In Hebrew, it means friendship. Ruth is the main character of the book, and she's a Moabitess, which was the eastern neighbor to Israel, right? It's about kind of where Jordan is now. maybe a little south of that, because Edom is kind of where Jordan is as well. And you got to remember that the name came from Lot's son, that one of the sons he had with one of his daughters. So he had two sons with each of his daughter, or son each with each of his daughters. After they had left Sodom, and the mother died, and they were hiding up in the caves, and they got their father drunk, and they both got impregnated by him. So one was Moab, the other was Ammon. And so again, both of these nations set up there east of the Jordan, one to the north, one to the south, and they caused a lot of problems for Israel over the time. Again, we see Ruth here is a foreigner, right? She is not one of, she's not an Israelite, but yet she winds up being in the lineage of Jesus. The author of the book, none is listed. The Talmud claims that Samuel wrote it. Again, I have no reason to discount that. The date of this, we're going to call it, circa somewhere around 1000 BC. Again, it was during the time of Judges. It was before David was being born, but yet right at the end of this book, we see the lineage of David being given. So, it had to be it had to be written after David was born, probably after David was anointed as king, but it was before Solomon became king. Otherwise, he probably would have been mentioned as well, because it was all part of the unified kingdom. Relation to the timeline books is that it was during the time of Judges. And in reality, this is the one bright spot during that time. You had all this bad stuff going on, all this rebellion against God, all this, rebellion against God being the king of the nation. And you have this great love story written in there. So the outline of the book is in chapter 1, you have Ruth following Naomi. Right in the beginning of Ruth, this just happens to be one of my more favorite books in the Old Testament. I know I say that probably about all of them, but I really love this story because it just brings so much to the whole story of Jesus Christ. But here, Naomi and Elimelech, her husband, right? They're in Judah. They're part of the tribe of Judah. They live really in Bethlehem, which later becomes the city of David, which is where Jesus is born. They're living there, but there's a famine in the land. So this is during one of the oppressed times, right? Things are not going well. So what do? They pick up stakes, they take their sons, and they go to Moab. Get away from the famine, get away from the oppression. So they settle in Moab. They marry their sons off to Ruth and to Oprah there. And and both the sons wind up dying, as well as Elimelech. And so now you got Naomi, and again, they're poor, they're broke, they have nothing, and she's got 2 daughter-in-laws. And she hears that things are better back home, right? So again, it must have been during the time right after a judge, and things were on the upswing. So she wants to go back home, and Ruth wants to go with her. And you have that great touching scene at the end of chapter 1 where Naomi's trying to get her to go back to her parents, and she's saying, nope, I'm going to go with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And they wind up going back to Israel, back to Judah, back to Bethlehem. Now, in chapter 2, Ruth starts to care for Naomi. Naomi is older. She's a widow. She really can't take care of herself. Ruth is a widow. They're broke. They don't have any money. They have to find some way of feeding themselves. Again, I think one of the great things about this story is that Ruth starts to take care of Naomi, but how she does that, she starts to go out and she starts to gather, the harvest. And again, people didn't get handouts, right? You didn't become a beggar. You had to go work for your food. You didn't just hang out waiting for somebody to take care of you. You went and did something. Now, the farmers, right, we're also told don't glean everything all the way to the end of your fields. Leave some of that for the widows and the orphans and the poor. And so that's what happens. She winds up, going to the fields of Boaz, who, as it turns out, is related to Naomi. He becomes a kinsman redeemer, which again is really important, and it's important in the story of the Old Testament, but it's also important in the story of the New Testament, because Christ becomes our kinsman redeemer. Christ becomes the one who redeems us out of our sin. Again, in the Old Testament time, all the land was supposed to go back every 50 years. You remember we talked about this last week when we talked about the different ceremonies and the festivals and all that every 50 years you had the year of Jubilee. And at that time, all the land was supposed to go back to the tribe of the inheritance, go back to the people. Well, when Naomi and Elimelech left, they probably sold their land, or maybe they just left. And so now they were back. They didn't have it. There was somebody in the family who could redeem it. As we find out in chapter 3, there's someone who's actually closer to Naomi than Boaz. But, Ruth, again, sees Boaz as the kinsman redeemer. He's like second in line. There's this budding love story going on. She goes down to the threshing floor, and he treats her honorably, takes care of her and Naomi. And then we get into chapter 4, where, Boaz, again, almost a comical part of the story, where he talks to the closer kinsman redeemer and says, hey, you want to redeem Naomi and marry Ruth? And the guy's going, yeah, what the heck, why not? And he goes, okay, well then, part of redeeming and part of that year of Jubilee, part of the land inheritance was that the firstborn needed to take on essentially Elimelech's name to perpetuate that family name. And so the kinsman redeemer didn't want to do that, but Boaz said, hey, I'm willing to do that. So he winds up marrying Ruth, winds up having Obed, who again winds up becoming the grandfather of David. And so again, you see how this line, the genealogy goes from there. We spent probably way longer than you wanted to, just after Easter, looking at the lineage of Jesus. So this whole book is just a whole metaphor for Jesus Christ, right? I mean, it shows us how he's our kinsman redeemer, but it also shows us the lineage of him. So there's just so much in this, just 4-chapter little book. It's a lot of fun to read. You can do it really in less than 15 minutes, and it's just a really, really good story. And that pretty much takes us out of all the stuff I wanted to talk about tonight, which leaves us really a fair amount of time for any questions, if you may have any this evening, or comments.
Mark?
Yes.
This is Rhonda. From when you're going through the Judges, it just makes me think God's been patient from the beginning of time. Just how much longer can he remain patient with us?
I think about that every day, Rhonda. And to a certain degree, every day we're supposed to be praying for that, right? Thy kingdom come. So I don't know. I mean, it's not really even biblical for us to decide that, because as Jesus told us, God, the Father's the only one who knows. Not even the Son knows the time or the date. But I agree with you. How much longer can he be patient with us?
Well, it certainly seems like we haven't gotten any better. We're all doing as we see fit. I mean, when you look across the United States and what's going on.
Yes, I agree. And Matter of fact, I was just having this conversation yesterday. I think about, the flood and him destroying the whole world, and I think about even the time of Judges and allowing the oppression to go on, and I keep thinking, man, just how bad were things then? When I look around now and see how bad things are and how far we've really strayed away from God, particularly in this country, how can we, you know, how much worse can things get before he decides to intervene? I don't know. I would also tell you that in Romans 11, he's basically saying that he's waiting on the time for all those Gentiles to be saved. And so I know I say this a lot, but when the bus gets filled up, Jesus is coming back. And whatever that number is. But I agree with you. How much longer can he put up with what's going on right now?
So we need to be ready to be on the bus.
We need to be ready to be on the bus.
When they talking about sin and the sin of Israel and the tribes, the exiling by God to scatter them out was part of the punishments that God levied on these tribes. And I was wondering, did all of the tribe, were all of them exiled or just some of them?
Well, so the northern kingdom, and we'll talk more about this in Kings, but the northern kingdom, some of the northern kingdom people got drug away into slavery. Some of them were left behind, and the Assyrians came in and intermingled with them, which is how we got the Samaritans. And then even in the south, which were really only the two tribes, not everybody got taken into exile. I mean, there was still some people left behind, and we'll see that when we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, where essentially the people who they thought couldn't contribute anything to the Babylonian Empire were left behind. But yes, there was always stragglers, I guess, for lack of a better word. But for the most part, the northern kingdom winds up getting wiped out and then intermarried and all that. And then, of course, the southern kingdom went in exile. They got to come back, but they were really never the same. And then, 72 AD or 70 AD, when Titus marches in and just wipes out the nation, they cease to become a nation. There's a couple other little rebellions up to about 134 AD, but then after that, you never hear anything of Israel again until 1948, which, makes me wonder if, again, where God will use evil, doesn't create it, but he will use it. With Hitler killing all the Jews, the 6 million Jews during World War II, and, as reparations for all that, they got their country back. So I'm sure that God used that, those concentration camps somehow.
Some of the books that I've read on the exile, they talked about the 10 tribes primarily, and I was just wondering why not all of them?
Well, again, because the kingdoms were split, so there was two different exiles, right? You had the 10 kingdoms of the north in 741, and then in 612 you had the southern kingdoms go. And it was different oppressors, right? The Assyrians oppressed the north, and then the Babylonians did the south. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for joining this evening.